How's it everyone who's watching this? This is my 44th video on the channel, and today we're going to be continuing our series on recapping the last week's shorts. In this episode, we'll be looking at Henri Bergson's understanding of analysis, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari's connective synthesis, and lastly, but not leastly, Melanie Klein's concept of binary splitting. In the process, we'll touch on Bergson's intuition, D&G's other syntheses of the unconscious, what exactly the paranoid schizoid position is, and more. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. To begin with, what exactly is analysis? In the eyes of Henri Bergson, it essentially refers to one of two ways of understanding a thing, the other, as we'll soon see, being intuition. The operation of analysis, as seen here, consists of looking at a thing from the outside, translating it into symbols, and then creating a relative account of it. To explain this last part a bit more, analysis for Bergson is always only partial. It is impossible to fully, or rather absolutely, grasp an object from an external symbol-based perspective. Moving on, the symbols involved in analysis could be all sorts of things, like centimeters, seconds, or even pieces of dialogue in a book. At its core, analysis is thus essentially an operation of conversion. As Bergson himself puts it, it involves expressing a thing as a function of something other than itself. To give some examples lifted directly from his essay in Introduction to Metaphysics, think about the simple action of lifting your arm. This is something that can be translated into symbols: 1 centimeter, 2 centimeters, 3, so on and so on. However, these symbols only mean something in relation to each other. There are always smaller units, things like millimeters, micrometers, and even nanometers. In other words, there is essentially an endless number of points between point A and point B. As is demonstrated in Zeno's dichotomy paradox, every line of movement has a halfway point, which itself has another halfway point, an operation that goes on endlessly ad infinitum. To give another example, imagine a town that has had every single nook and cranny photographed. These images all represent specific points of view, and as such still don't capture the nuance and dynamism inherent in the real physical town itself. Representation always fails to capture every single element. That is to say, it always falls short, although it must be said that it's not without fail a terrible thing. Sometimes it's necessary. In Bergson's eyes, what he calls the positive sciences require analysis. Even things like biology discusses their object through the lens of symbols, definable now as discrete units, such as anatomical elements and organs. Metaphysics, on the other hand, is defined by another approach, one that dispenses of symbols and seeks to understand things in their absolute totality. The operation that allows for this is intuition, something I can only summarize here but which I'll probably make a video on in the future. As shown here, intuition essentially involves taking a viewpoint internal to the object and having what Bergson calls intellectual sympathy for it. This allows one to understand even the inexpressible or untranslatable elements of it, like the living, breathing dynamics of a town we just discussed. Bergson describes this intuition as a simple act, something that, quite frankly, is a bit deceptive, at least from my experience with Deleuze's Bergsonism. However, to simplify a bit, we can see how intuition might work in the case of our own person. As Bergson says, even if it's possible to intellectually sympathize with nothing else, we always do with our own selves. Below crystallized memories and other such symbols, we experience our own being as a flow. In other words, as a process that continually plays out through time. To try avoid his concept of duration for the sake of time, this flow is filled with heterogeneous inexpressible elements. We simply are. We don't exist in discrete bite-sized symbols, but rather engage in a constant becoming, always changing and shifting without having any firm breaks in the stream's continuity. Using the same example from earlier, the act of lifting your arm can also be understood absolutely through the simple application of intuition. It moves from point A to point B processually, in a fluid movement. Rather than getting bogged down in Zeno's dichotomy paradox, intuition is thus the only method to understand something completely or absolutely. It's with this that we get to our second concept we'll be looking at today, Deleuze and Guattari's notion of the connective synthesis of production, developed in the first volume of Capitalism and Schizophrenia, Anti-Oedipus. To first give some context, this, alongside the disjunctive synthesis of recording and the conjunctive synthesis of consummation, comprise the three syntheses of the unconscious, a set of concepts developed to mirror Kant's syntheses of apperception and to describe the functioning of DNG's infamous body without organs. Although we'll only be looking at one, these are an important part of their transcendental critique of psychoanalysis and the Oedipus complex as a whole. Turning now to defining the notion, the connective synthesis is something built upon three Freudian concepts, those of drives, cathexis, and polymorphous perversity, things you may remember if you've watched my video on Jean-François Lyotard's libidinal band. To quickly summarize, the life drives produce libido, what I'll call productive desire from now on, essentially being a sort of psychical energy. This is in turn invested into things, the process being rendered into English with the neologism cathexis. Finally, polymorphous perversity, something discussed at length in that Lyotard video, describes states where productive desire can be invested, or rather, cathected into anything to achieve gratification. The connective synthesis essentially functions according to the logic of its perversity, linking all sorts of heterogeneous things together. Organ machines, essentially equivalent to the partial objects of Melanie Klein that we'll look at in a bit, are constantly being coupled together. For example, the eye machine of a baby connects to the face of its mother, whilst its mouth machine links with her breast during nursing. These organ machines are defined solely by their function. There is no special significance attached to one or the other, like you would find in classical psychoanalysis. Instead, it would be better to actually talk about an eating machine, since, in the words of Deleuze and Guattari, the mouth also acts as a talking machine, a breathing machine, or even an anal machine, in the case of certain eating disorders. To return to the connective synthesis, productive desire is what makes these connections. In addition, as explained by Eugene W. Holland's fantastic guide to Anti-Oedipus, the functionless nature of organ machines means that, in the case of a baby which couples its feeding and looking machines onto his mother's breast and face, the synthesis of production only makes those connections. There is no overarching identity created, no specific mother to which the two machines belong to. Summing up, DNG described the entire process as one of and then, that goes on constantly and continually. With this definition in mind, we can turn now to how the synthesis is used to develop their critique of psychoanalysis. Just like there are legitimate and illegitimate metaphysical uses of Kant's three syntheses, so are therefore the connective synthesis of production. For them, something underlined by Guattari in particular again and again, psychoanalysis isn't something to be thrown away, even if many readers today seem to think so. Instead, it does many things right. However, those things are poisoned by an illegitimate, or rather transcendent, use of these syntheses. For example, just take the case of free association. In many ways, this is a perfect example of a connective synthesis in action. Just look at how different elements get coupled together as the patient goes on the couch. However, by subjecting this imminent operation to interpretation and privileging one thing over everything else, like, for instance, the figure of a father or mother in the case of the Oedipus complex, the synthesis becomes organized in a transcendent manner. It's interfered with from without by the imposition of certain expectations. In other words, it's no longer polymorphously perverse. This falls under what DNG call the paralogism of extrapolation, a set of illegitimate uses of the syntheses they accuse both Melanie Klein and sort of Jacques Lacan of falling victim to. For those who don't know the word, a paralogism simply refers to an illogical or fallacious piece of reasoning, particularly one that seems correct on the surface. We won't go into too much detail here, but if you all are interested, I might make a video specifically exploring the syntheses and their corresponding paralogisms. With that out of the way, the first sense of extrapolation that they accuse Lacan of falling victim to is one of the same with what was just discussed in relation to interpretation. Lacan isolating specific terms or signifiers, like the name of a father or the phallus, as overarching elements. The reason why I say sort of is that DNG aren't really clear on whether or not they feel Lacanian psychoanalysis endorses, or in a roundabout manner, actually rejects the paralogism. Lacan perhaps seeing it as what actually prevails, not something to be championed as necessary. Moving on to the second form the paralogism of extrapolation takes, they describe the use of a connective synthesis to form a complete object from a collection of partial ones. This is endorsed by Klein when she describes the paranoid schizoid position as giving way to the depressive one, something we'll touch on in a moment but which can quickly be described as a movement away from splitting objects to joining them together into wholes. For DNG's part, they don't deny the fact that whole objects exist. Rather, they argue that the conversion is something transcendent, based in capturing productive desire in a specific way. Additionally, unlike Klein, they don't think that this integration ever occurs completely. In a rather Nietzschean way, D&G instead considers subjectivity as involving the constant unconscious struggle between different perspectives, each one with their own kind of what Holland calls a mastery of the psyche, a specific idea of what it means to be a whole object that's always at risk of falling out of power. By ignoring this, they feel Klein misses a fundamental aspect of subjectivity. With this sort of awkward segue, we arrive at the last concept we'll be looking at today, Melanie Klein's notion of binary splitting, a fundamental part of the paranoid schizoid position that Deleuze and Guattari love so much. Before we get into it, I feel some background will be a bit helpful. Basically, rather than having a set of stages with specific start and end dates, such as found in Freud's work, Klein conceptualized development as being organized by two periods, with variable durations and the ability to reoccur or alternate later in life, those being the aforementioned paranoid, schizoid, and depressive positions, which play out in that order. As demonstrated here, the child in the paranoid schizoid position splits objects, definable as anything that can be connected with libido other than the ego, such as people or specific body parts in this case, into a good and bad portion. This is done to deal with a myriad of anxieties, the chief amongst them being the conflict between the life and death drives, if my ancient psychoanalytic dictionary is to be believed. Whilst pictured here, the splitting of the breast is essentially Klein's go-to example, a result of object relation theory's tendency to focus on the mother first and foremost, as one of the first connections newborns make. In Notes on Some Schizoid Mechanisms, Klein describes how the good breast is seen by the baby as gratifying, whilst the bad breast is frustrating. Essentially, to deal with its inability to understand nuance and struggles with the ambivalence instituted from birth by the drive's interplay, it undertakes splitting and directs its hate and love to specific aspects of the object. This operation allows it to tell itself that it's not the mother, or rather at this point the good breast, that has forgotten about it or cares about something else, but rather it's that the bad breast is standing in her or its way. This whole process is described under the heading of schizoid, after the work of the Scottish psychoanalyst Ronald Fairbairn, since it involves schizos or breaks in the object, the inability to move on from a position also being characteristic of schizophrenia. The additional descriptor of paranoid comes into play in how the bad object, as something that blocks gratification, is seen as persecutory in nature. It stands in the infant's way, thus provoking fear and anxiety in it. I won't go too much further in this video, since I'm thinking of tackling schizoid mechanisms in a very short while, but to conclude, I'd just like to mention that the binary splitting of an object, where there is one good and one bad partial object, isn't the only form of the paranoid schizoid defense. Rather, there's also the splitting of the ego and what Klein describes as fragmentation, a more destructive kind of division that sees the object or ego disintegrating entirely. It's on this note that I'd like to end the video, having now looked at all three shorts from last week. I truly hope you enjoyed or learned something, and if you feel I got anything wrong or wasn't as clear as I could have been, please do feel free to let me know in the comments so I can do better. Next time, I promise we'll be finally finishing the 3 ecologies by Félix Guattari. Until then, bye!